Okay, so I'm here this evening with Professor Eric Kaufmann of Birkbeck University. He's formerly a Belfer Center Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and has been the author of numerous books on political demography. The most recent one he was a co-editor on, which is named Political Demography, Oxford 2012 edition. Previously, Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth, about the demography of religion, which was released in 2010 under Profile Books. And he's current professor of politics at Birkbeck College on the University of London, with primary areas of interest including the politics of nationalism, ethnicity, and religion. Eric, thank you for coming.
Thanks very much.
We'll just do a few questions and won't keep anyone too long. So the first thing I'd like to focus on is your most recent book, Political Demography, obviously quite a very broad term. If you could just outline the core premise of the book that you co-edited.
So political demography is the study of the politics of population change. So it's about taking demography, which is a subject which has been studied by demographers in what I would argue to be a somewhat insular manner, taking concerns with timing of births and sorts of issues like that. Interesting, but to try and cross-fertilize that with politics. So to say, what are the political implications of demographic shifts?
And broadly, I mean, I know it must be very context-specific, but what are often the main implications of demography? I mean, presumably an indirect effect on politics. So demography can have different effects on politics, sometimes direct effect, but more often an indirect effect. So, for example, one of the things that happens with a very young population, so age structure is a major area of study in political demography. So you can have a very young population, what's known as a youth bulge. Samuel Huntington talked about the youth bulge, where if you have a lot of young people, that's too many young people to be employed in a given economy. The economy is too small to handle all that labor, so you get a lot of young people without employment who then can be recruited into, for example, insurgent movements. And so you often have a correlation between a very young population, youth bulge, and various kinds of politics, especially political violence. So that's one area. The other is an aging population, which can have the reverse effect. So some people talk about, there's an author, Mark Haas, who writes in our collection on political demography about what he calls the geriatric piece, older societies being less likely to be involved in warfare. And in fact, there's even a book that argued that the Lebanese Civil War, 1975 to 90, in 2006, there was the potential for a reprise of that. And one of the arguments for the reason that didn't take place was because the birth rate had come down so much, the population was not as young as it was in the sort of 70s, 80s, and that simply didn't provide as much tinder for violence. The other part of this is that if you look at, there's an argument that says that youth bulge tends to lead to a lot of insurgent movements, challenges to the existing order, but maturation, as the population grows older, sometimes that is conducive to democratization. So one of the authors in our book, Rich Singh Kata, makes the argument that with the Tunisian population, with the whole Arab Spring, the population had matured in its age structure to the point where there were less young people loose on the streets, if you want to put it in those terms. And therefore, the middle classes and the regime could afford to take a chance and start to embark on reforms. So that there is a timing issue whereby as a country goes through what's known as a demographic transition, that is the transition from high death rates and high birth rates to low death rates, low birth rates, that there's a greater potential for it to become a democracy. Because the elites will be less worried about youthful insurgencies and more willing, therefore, to reform in the direction of democracy. So that is another argument. Then you've got work that looks at issues of migration, immigration, which is related to the fact that some parts of the world, developing world, very young population,
developed world very older or aging population, and therefore pressure for migration from the global south to the north, and then so that then brings ethnic change. And so this is another branch, the branch I'm most interested in, which is how population changes, that is, differences between countries in their ethnic makeup. So if you take a country, shifts in the ethnic makeup, the state of California going from being 85-90% white in 1960 to being roughly 45% white today, that kind of shift in the ethnic composition can be associated with violent conflict, can be associated with a sort of reaction on the part of the majority. So, for example, if you look at a number of different societies, Ivory Coast is one example where you had a big expansion in the number of largely Muslim population increased as a share of the total, and that was part of the reason, in fact, one of the reasons why the conflicts broke out in 2000 and are ongoing there. One of the arguments is that the Southerners, now there's also some fabrication of identity here, but their thinking was, well, we're being swamped here and outvoted, and so therefore the candidate who won, who was from the north, was seen as illegitimate because he was seen as in a way foreign. And this kind of ethnic conflict, you can see it in Northern Ireland, the Protestants worried, Protestants' concern about the growth of the Catholic population who had a higher birth rate. You can even see it even in a country like Britain with the increase in Muslim population, or you see that in Holland, France, etc. The far right is a manifestation, perhaps, of demographic shifts, ethno-demographic. And then finally you have religious shifts, which we can talk about in a minute.
Sure, thank you. It strikes me as a very all-encompassing issue, which perhaps it's difficult to pin down and study in a way, because it's like you've linked in sort of the youth bulge and the ageing population is very almost synonymous with the economic opportunities of these respective parts of the population. So how, I suppose, sort of a very generic question, but how do you work out what you study and what you include and what you don't include?
Yeah, good question, because there's a link between a poor country having a high fertility rate and therefore a young population. So how do you disentangle those factors? And wealthier countries having low birth rates and older population. What I would say, however, is that that these things don't move exactly in tandem. So Bangladesh and Pakistan, Bangladesh had a much more aggressive, not aggressive, but a well-planned family planning program, which was instituted earlier, and so their birth rates have come down more quickly than in Pakistan, where there was religious resistance. And so you can have countries, even though their income per capita is the same, Bangladesh's birth rate is lower. And so these things don't always move together. So or you can get a country that is relatively poor. So you have places that are relatively poor that actually get their birth rate down quite quickly. You have some places that are relatively wealthy where the birth rate, so in some of the Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the birth rates didn't come down. Even though they're quite wealthy, actually the birth rates were still relatively high for quite a while. So they aren't exactly the same thing, but you're right, there is a link there. I mean, one of the issues in China, because of the one-child policy, is that China might get old in a way, have an old population before they get rich. So, for example, by 2020, China will be an older society than the United States, but will have a much lower per capita income. So the implications for pensions and for a whole series of other economic productivity issues are greater in that situation.
And this with the China issue is a fundamental flaw in the economic growth of the preceding decade and the coming decade, or the coming decades, is that they've got this hundreds of millions of people who are going to be less and less productive, to use a fairly unsympathetic economic term, and yet still be requiring care and investment.
And one of the arguments is that obviously it depends what people's expectations are. So if, in China the families are expected to take care of the old, but still that would mean therefore that the young people are having to support their elderly parents, So that will be a drag on economic growth. Also, military implications it'll mean more resources are going to be diverted towards welfare and pensions as opposed to, say, military spending. And even within the military, more resources, and Mark Haas makes this point, more resources will be expended on pensions, military pensions, and military recruitment costs than on weapons procurement. And so there's an extent to which, as a country gets older, it becomes harder to field a military and to spend your money on weapons. The other part of this, too, is that the geriatric peace hypothesis is that, if people are only having one child, the parental attitude towards that child going to war might be different than if they have 6, 7 children, whereby one child who's lost is maybe less, in a way, it's in a crude way, you could argue life is cheaper in some sense, and parents would be more willing to see those extra sons go out to war than in a case where it's, a one-child policy and it's your only child. So that could also have a pacific effect. So there are all these kinds of issues. The other thing I should mention is the balance in population between countries. So Russia is losing population, and Ethiopia is projected to have a larger population than Russia by, I think, the 2020s. So you have a shift in balance of power, potential shifts. It's not the only thing. GNP per capita is probably more important, but also you have to have a large population, and if you're losing population, 1 million off your population potentially, as Russia has in the recent past, then that can have an effect on your power projection and military power. So there are these issues as well.
Of course, it's I'd say very fundamental. So as I mentioned in the introduction, you mentioned previously, your book before Political Demography was Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth of 2010. So just generally, perhaps in a few sentences, what's the argument there and what are the implications?
Well, there's kind of two arguments. One is the argument that the world as a whole is getting more religious because most of the world's population growth is in the developing world, which is 95% religious. And most of the what's called below replacement fertility, less than 2.1 children per woman, most of the societies that have that fertility rate are in the developed world. So it's West Europe, East Asia, North America to some extent. So that you're getting population aging and decline in the secular parts of the world, and you're getting population growth in the religious parts of the world. So that's one thing. The second thing is the immigrants coming to the West are going to be religious immigrants entering secular societies, so they actually make Western societies more religious than they would otherwise have been, and so that's another thing. But further than that, what I argued was that there's a connection between being very pious and having a high birth rate. That holds in every country of the world, but it especially holds for religious fundamentalists, and particular types of religious fundamentalists who are very closed, that is, they grow through high fertility rather than through proselytization. And so groups such as the ultra-Orthodox of Israel are a paradigm case of that. And so these groups are resistant to secularism, they're resistant to modernization. And my argument in this book was to say, well, this could be a future. That is, religious fundamentalists expanding through high birth rates and through very strong retention of the children in the religious community, because the strong fundamentalist groups, it's not just a place you show up to for an hour or two on a Sunday. It's actually your life. It's your recreation, your friends, your family. You can't just leave it, or you more or less have to cut yourself off from who you are and your family. So there's strong retention and very high fertility, which is a very good combination for rapid increase. The third thing is, in a context where the world as a whole is undergoing population aging, and the world will have below replacement fertility by the end of our century. So in a situation where everybody else is having very few children and you're going against that grain, the fertility gap widens over time between fundamentalists and the others. Israel, interestingly, if you take the Jewish population, even though secular Jews have the highest birth rates of any sort of Western, if you want to call it a Western country, they have the highest birth rates of secular people in the West, and yet the ultra-Orthodox have 3 or 4 times their birth rate. So the ultra-Orthodox now, they went from a few percentage of the school system in 1960. The Jewish first grade class in Israel is now a third ultra-Orthodox. And the projections are certainly by the second half of this century, they will be the majority now. They don't serve in the military, the men don't work. There are all kinds of issues that are thrown up by this. So there's no question that, and already they're flexing their political muscle in various ways regarding issues of who can be a Jew, baptisms, burials, so on.
Could you argue this was sort of a return to the past sort of aspect? Because obviously we had heavily religious societies in the Middle Ages, and then we've had the Renaissance and the rise of secularism. And now do we almost seem to be returning back to this? I've heard theories of neo-medievalism in international politics, but this seems more of a demographic take on.
Yeah, neo-medievalism is more, I think, to do with political structures. But I would say yes and no. It's definitely not a return to the past in the sense that these movements are quite new in many ways. Most fundamentalists, if you take Jewish fundamentalism, Islamic, and also Protestant fundamentalism, it's all 19th century, 20th century development. So they aren't a throwback, and that's important. So they can't be sort of just throwing education and money and modernity at them is not going to do anything. If anything, it'll actually, they thrive on. They are a modern phenomenon. They're modern because without strong secularism, they probably wouldn't have arisen. They are a reaction to the secularization of Christianity, the modernization of Christian theology, or similarly in Islam, the secularism of Kemalism or of the Shah in Iran or the Baathists. So they are a reaction to secularism. So they're a product in many ways of modernity. Not entirely, but... But the end result will be a shift towards a more... I mean, we're looking down the road. In Israel, it's this century, but in the Muslim world, it might be... Well, in the Muslim world, of course, you have had Islamist success already, politically, in some places. In Saudi Arabia, and I would argue Saudi Arabia already is an Islamist society, and remains to be seen what will happen with AKP and the Brotherhood in Egypt. But religion definitely not fading away. That's the message for. The other thing I would say about the Muslim world, well, we may come on to that in a minute, but it's just to say that I believe demography of religion has been important there. It's been important in the United States, in the rise of the Christian right as well. But where it's most prominent is definitely in Israel, amongst the ultra-Orthodox.
Sure. So you just briefly mentioned the United States, and obviously we're just of the election in November. Obama was described as working together a sort of massive coalition of different social groups, the women, Hispanics. He took 93% of the black vote, which is just an unheard of division in modern politics, to my eyes, and it is anyway. And the quote, which has gone around all the media since his victory, is that of a congressman, I think it was, of the Republican Party, said his party weren't generating enough angry white guys to win the elections, as they have been as little as 8 years ago now. So from that, I mean, what's your take on that election, and what's your take on the broader demographic trends on the immediate to middle future on American politics?
Yeah, I mean
and therefore foreign policy.
Yeah, a very good question, because really everyone in 2008, 2004, 2000, even going back to Clinton, I mean, people had been talking up this demographic shift, but of course, the Hispanic population is a much younger population than the white population in the U.S., and therefore the impacts were much more evident in the delivery rooms and the primary schools than they were in the electorate, because you have to be 18 to vote, so anyone under 18 doesn't count, and the median voter is probably around 40. And so the last thing to change, so the ethnic composition of the U.S. population was already evolving quite rapidly. The young population now, I believe the 50% of births now in the U.S. are to non-whites, if we include Hispanics in that category. So there's been a massive change in the delivery rooms, but the change in the electorate was delayed because it takes time for this bulge to work its way through the population pyramid. And so as recently as the 1992 election, or with Clinton 1992, 1996, I mean, the proportion of the electorate made up of minorities was, I'm trying to think of the number, it might have been 15% or so. In this election, or sorry, it was 13% in 92, and it was double that, 26% in 2008, I believe. So a doubling, really, of that minority share. And I think this election was the first election where you could say, actually, that made a massive difference in a way. And because in 2004, Bush actually did quite well with the Hispanic vote. But in this election, there's no question, I think, that political demography matters. Political scientists have a tendency to think it's only political marketing that counts. They underplay these demographic shifts. But in the U.S. context, the partisan differences have become very solidified. And so you've got parties for whom the base really matters. So the size of your base, given that there are very few swing voters, the size of the base matters a great deal. And if your base is growing demographically compared to the other person's base, then you have an inbuilt advantage and you don't need to swing quite as many voters. And so, for example, Obama didn't have to do as well with the white working class vote in the Midwest as might have been the case in the past. And I think that actually will become more consequential. So if we look ahead, a paper that I published with Vegard Skierbeck and Anne Goujon, who are based at the at IASA, which is IIASA in Austria. They do very interesting demographic work, and we did a projection of the political parties, and we looked at fertility, that is the birth rate of typical Republican-leaning women and Democratic-leaning women, and we looked at immigration as well, and we looked at age structure, and it turns out that what's happening is that the Democrats have an advantage because immigrants are predominantly Hispanic and Asian, and therefore leaning towards the Democrats. We saw that in this election, 70%. And so immigration benefits the Democrats. There's no question about that. So the growth of the Hispanic and Asian population, you would argue, would be benefiting the Democrats. On the Republican side, the only thing they would have is higher fertility because of the religiosity. And so you have more evangelicals, more conservative Christians in the Republican Party, and more Mormons, who have the highest birth rate of any religious denomination. But of course, Mormons are still only 2% of the population. In the very long run, I mean, the projections we did were interesting. They suggested a swing in partisanship of about 2.5 percentage points between now and early 2040s. That's enough to swing more electoral contests in the Democratic favor. However, if you go towards the end of the century, of course, you can't make, I mean, demographic projections out a century are very, very sketchy, but in a century from now, then that Republican religious fertility would have made enough of a difference, actually, to swing things the other way. But certainly in the next few decades, in our lifetimes, that won't be the case. But the point I would like to say is that, there is a limit to this kind of demography. I mean, demography is the most predictable of the social sciences, so we already know what the 50-somethings of the 2050s, what their ethnic composition is, because we know that they are going to be only 50% white, the median voter. So we can project that ahead with a very high degree of reliability based on age structure. However, what we can't say is what will happen to the Hispanic identity. And so where I would sort of draw a caution is to say, well, Hispanics who are Protestant, Hispanics who identify as white on the census are probably more likely to become Republican, and they already are more likely to vote Republican. So with time, with the assimilation of the Hispanic population, they will probably, more of them will go Republican. So that's going to counterbalance the growth in the Hispanic population. So it's not automatically going to translate into a Democratic advantage.
I think it was Reagan who said that many Hispanics are Republican, they just don't know it yet.
Right.
So sort of they have these conservative social values, and share a lot of the values of the Republican Party, but they just sort of like the Labour Conservative split in this country, that you just can't see yourself voting for that party because they just aren't seen to represent you, regardless of their image of who they do represent is as important as the ideas that they represent.
Yeah, and that's where I think it would take a Hispanic whose first native language is English rather than Spanish, who is born in the United States, who might be Protestant either through conversion or through parents' conversion, and who identifies as white on the census. Those are all indicators of somebody who is assimilating into that sort of white Protestant English-speaking matrix. And those kinds of Hispanics, I think, are probably going to be moving in a Republican direction. So there's going to be an assimilation of the Hispanics in the direction of the Republican Party, just like white Catholics, the Irish and the Italians and all these groups who used to be heavily Democratic, now are more likely to vote Republican. So actually that's going to go, I think, going to counterbalance this big demographic shift, which is going to favor the Democrats. So you really, I think you have to take a holistic view. You can't just read off the numbers of Hispanics and say, yeah, the Democrats are going to be the natural party of government. You have to also factor in this assimilation, which is going on. The other thing, too, I want to say about Hispanic demography is it's actually slowing down in the sense the birth rates have come down amongst Hispanic women quite a bit, especially with the economic crisis, and also the immigration's come down a lot. So some of the growth potential in the Hispanic population has eased a bit, although the age structure of the Hispanic population is still very young, and therefore most of those ethnic changes will happen, regardless of what goes on with immigration and fertility.
We have one more broad question for this talk. So you've talked a lot more about the contemporary issues, perhaps inevitably, because that's what has more effect on everyone's lives. But would you say that demography and the politicization of it is a bigger issue today than it has been, say, 30, 50, 100 years ago? Or would you say it's we're interpreting it differently today?
Well, I think it's been an issue in the past, but there is a difference because the demographic transition, which begins in the 18th century, is a shift from high birth rates and high death rates to low birth rates and low death rates. And so what determined demography in the past was more mortality. So the fact that the white settlers in the Americas brought diseases like smallpox, which really devastated the Amerindian population, was demographic. So the Amerindian population really declined sharply through mortality, which is part of demography, which made it easier for the white settlers to take over. But fertility rates, birth rates, were less of an issue because everyone more or less had to have a lot of children because most of them died before the age of 1, and you needed children to work the land. There was very poor contraception. For all these reasons, fertility was not really under the same level of control as it is today. What happens when you get big shifts when you get the demographic transition is that mortality, death rates, and especially infant mortality, counts for less, and fertility starts to count for more, and the differences in birth rates are not so much tied to nutrition and material circumstances as they were in the past, but they're tied more to cultural values because of this transition, particularly what's called the second demographic transition, where we get the transition to very low, below replacement birth rates. Now it's the case that if you are religious, you maybe will say, no, I'm going to have a family, I'm going to have a third child, fourth child. Or if you're a fundamentalist, maybe a fifth and sixth. If you're secular, on average in Europe, women who say they have no religion have one child on average per couple. So a very low birth rate. So all of a sudden, I would say now values matter a lot more for fertility. And what that means is that populations that are holding certain values are poised to increase. So that is groups that are religiously fundamentalist are poised to increase, whereas those that are secular are poised to decrease. And that actually cuts across ethnicity more than... So it's not the case that Muslims are having more kids than Christians and Jews. Those sorts of differentiations are, I think, fading. Just like the Protestant-Catholic birth rate divide, the Catholics used to have much higher birth rate. That's come to an end more or less in the 70s and 1980s. However, it's the within religion differences that are going to become more pressing. So it's going to be fundamentalist Protestants versus secular Protestants, if you like. Secular Muslims versus fundamentalist Muslims, or even moderate Muslims versus fundamentalist Muslims. That's really going to be the division. So it's the fundamentalists that are going to have the bigger birth rates. Now, the other thing is that the demographic transition takes place unevenly. So the richer countries it takes place in first. It takes place amongst the richer or the better educated, let's say, ethnic groups within countries first. So that unevenness means that the certain ethnic groups that are younger will grow faster. So the Catholics of Northern Ireland, demographic transition happened later, therefore their population was younger, grew faster, and fed into the Northern Ireland conflict because the Protestants were very scared of being outbred and losing power. And that dynamic, you can see it arguably in Kosovo, and you can see it perhaps in parts of Bosnia as well, to some extent in Lebanon, to some extent in Israel. So in many conflict spots, there's a demographic element as well. And I think even when we talk about the rise of the far right in Europe and anti-immigration politics, that is also, I think, related to political demography. So it's just to say that I think this is more of an issue now. There have been times in the past where birth rates and population growth has been an issue. Some have argued that a lot of that the Vikings and the Arabs and some of these groups that sort of swept out of their homelands, even the conquistadors, that this was driven by surplus children who couldn't inherit land and therefore had to go off and become adventurers. So there is an argument that there have been waves, these waves of conquest were in some way related to demographic shifts. So it has happened in the past, but I think it's a more important issue today because of the demographic transition and the unevenness of that transition.
Okay, great. That's all we have time for.